Kalshi in talks for $40 billion valuation. Sequoia and Wellington are anchoring around that prices the platform as the default venue for regulated event contracts. Smaller platforms now face a choice: secure equivalent licensing or watch their best traders migrate within 12 months. The $750 million check also buys board influence over which new contracts get priority. Expect focus on midterms rather than niche sports. That timeline leaves competitors scrambling for capital before the next election cycle peaks. Anthropic eyes $6 billion acquisition of Decart. The $6 billion price tag reveals how scarce high-quality simulation data has become for frontier labs. OpenAI now confronts the same data bottleneck that prompted the deal. This forces it to either match the acquisition pace or accept a gap in world modeling benchmarks by late 2026. Integration will likely shift research focus towards safety constraints rather than pure scaling. Watch whether this move accelerates similar bids for other small model teams over the next 6 quarters. DeepSeek releases V4-Pro model. Operators testing the new release report no drop in output quality despite the steep discount. This undercuts the assumption that frontier performance requires Western-scale spend. Moonshot must now decide whether to cut Kimi K3 pricing or lose production workloads to the cheaper alternative within the next quarter. The gap also compresses margins for any API provider still charging Opus-level rates. Expect follow-on releases from other Chinese labs to target the same cost band before year-end. Tencent triples capex to $7.8 billion for AI. 52.8 billion yuan now flows almost entirely into GPU clusters rather than consumer internet bets. This move also signals that domestic compute self-sufficiency now outweighs short-term profitability for the entire group. Alibaba faces the choice of matching that infrastructure ramp or ceding cloud market share to enterprise customers seeking domestic alternatives. The increased capacity will likely flood the market with subsidized inference tokens, pressuring margins across the sector within 18 months. Nebius revenue surges 454% to $582 million. The 41% EBITDA margin tells the real tale here. Nebius cleared $236 million in the quarter, even as short sellers circled. That profitability runway suggests they lock in multi-year GPU leases before rivals scale capacity. The backlog growth at 56% quarter-over-quarter points to sticky contracts. Watch enterprise buyers shift workloads once the next round of HBM supply hits in 12 months. Cloud providers lose their AI compute wedge by early next year. Cerebrus revenue hits $180 million, shares fall 16%. The drop traces to a single OpenAI contract whose warrants clip reported revenue, even as the backlog sits at $25.4 billion. This structure forces OpenAI to either extend the deal or watch Cerebrus pivot to other hyperscalers within 18 months. Competitors now face the same amortization math if they chase similar anchor tenants. Enterprise customers should expect tighter capacity guarantees once the warrant vesting schedule matures next year. Otherwise, the reported growth number stays permanently detached from cash flow. Google raises Pixel 11 prices by $100. Memory chip shortages now reach the consumer aisle as the Pixel 11 carries a $100 premium tied directly to AI-accelerated DRAM. This forces Samsung and Apple to either absorb the cost or pass it along by the next cycle. Watch what happens to Micron's margins when these contracts hit volume shipments in the second half. Device makers without long-term supply deals face margin compression they cannot hide from buyers. Buyers will notice the difference in flagship models first. CXMT becomes most valuable Chinese company. Overtaking Tencent puts a memory foundry at the top of Chinese market cap tables for the first time. The valuation surge reveals more about restricted access to foreign chips than about CXMT's current process technology. Washington responds by tightening export rules on equipment within 12 months. Domestic smartphone makers gain a reliable NAND source they can cite in supply chain audits. Foreign memory vendors lose their last pricing lever in the China market by the end of next year. YMTC leads Kioxia in flash memory shipments. Shipments tell only half the story when margins diverge sharply by end market. YMTC's climb to 14% share came mostly through consumer and mainstream SSD channels, while AI server demand still routes through established suppliers at double the price. This leaves Samsung and Micron room to protect their high-end pricing for at least another year. Enterprise procurement teams should prepare for sharper negotiations on standard flash once the volume leader floods secondary markets later this year before prices drop further. Lovable raises $400 million at $13.3 billion valuation. $500 million in annualized revenue sets a new speed record for any AI-native company reaching that scale. Rivals must now publish their own ARR figures within 6 months or risk seeing their valuations marked down by comparison. The round size itself matters less than how quickly users convert it into paying contracts, a metric that will define term sheets across the category through 2026. This forces every competitor to accelerate enterprise sales or accept thinner multiples next round. Cognition in talks for $40 billion valuation. Months between rounds rarely produce 8-figure valuation jumps without a product milestone that competitors must answer. Cognition's rumored $40 billion target now forces Anthropic and OpenAI to decide whether they embed similar coding agents natively or risk losing developer mindshare inside their own platforms. The speed also signals that enterprise licensing deals closed faster than expected, tightening the window for any late entrants to the agent market by mid-next year at the latest. Thrive Holdings raises $2 billion at $12 billion valuation. SoftBank's participation alongside existing backers points to a bet on infrastructure layers rather than model training itself. Thrive's new capital at this scale will likely accelerate data center build-outs that compete directly with CoreWeave and Lambda for GPU allocation contracts. That pressure could push smaller cloud providers to specialize in inference-only workloads within 12 months or exit the race entirely. CoreWeave will respond by locking in longer-term GPU supply agreements before any of the new capacity comes online. Form Energy raises $750 million for batteries. Google's data centers now anchor the first major offtake for these iron-air units. That customer mix changes the deployment math for everyone else. Utilities locked into lithium supply deals will see their cost curves flatten once Form hits scale manufacturing next year. 2 states running pilot programs will likely convert those into full contracts by Q4 2025. This sidelines at least one gas peaker bid per state. Margin pressure now hits shorter duration battery makers who cannot match that duration without subsidies. Meta shuts 750,000 youth accounts in Australia. Meta's age checks just failed their largest public test in one market. The real story is how many accounts re-register within days using different numbers. Apple and Google now face pressure to embed stricter verification in their app stores before Australian rules expand. Expect at least one other platform to receive similar demands by Q2 next year. Smaller developers lose the easy path to youth users they relied on for growth metrics. Navi plans $315 million IPO in India. Navi's known book faces fresh scrutiny the moment the prospectus hits public view. RBI's new digital lending caps force disclosure of repricing assumptions that other fintechs have avoided in prior filings. That single section sets the template for every Indian fintech IPO this year. Paytm showed how fast multiples compress after regulatory surprises surface. Anchor investors will bake that risk into their bids before the roadshow begins. The filing will reveal whether growth targets survive the new rules intact. Index leads $500 million round for new AI lab. 7 former DeepMind researchers now have the capital to build outside the usual US clusters. That talent concentration forces OpenAI and Anthropic to open London offices or lose alignment specialists. The lab has no released model yet, so the bet rests entirely on the team's prior papers. Index's choice to back a European lab signals that frontier work no longer requires Silicon Valley compute deals. The next move belongs to US labs deciding how to respond on hiring.